Hi, this class is to talk about type 1 and type 2 errors in hypothesis testing. And let me tell you what type 1 error and type 2 error is. Type 1 error, remember, in hypothesis test we have null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. The errors are this. The type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is true. So we are committing a mistake of rejecting the current state of affairs, the current status quo, but the current status quo is true. How we control for this type 1 error is using the level of significance. Remember the alpha that you learned in chapter 8? So the alpha is the level of significance. The smaller the alpha, the less likely I am to commit this mistake of rejecting something that is true, if the current state of affairs is true. Okay? And the type 2 error is accepting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is not true, when the null hypothesis is false. Is accepting the current status quo, but the current status quo is wrong. Okay? It is difficult to control the probability of making this type of error. Okay? I'm gonna show you some examples. I'm gonna show you some examples before I show you this graph, this chart. Okay? So let me go to MindTap. So in MindTap chapter 9, we have section 9.2, type 1 and type 2 errors. If you click here, then you have this menu is very small menu. Here you can read, and I suggest you to read. Don't take only what I tell you, show you in the videos. Read to complement your learning. Please read. And if we click here, we go back, and then we have some problems. Let's take a look at this one. Duke Energy reported the cost of electricity for an efficient home in a particular neighborhood of Cincinnati, Ohio, was $104 per month. A researcher believes that the cost is higher. Okay, so the researcher believes that the cost is higher. So a sample of homes in this Chicago neighborhood will be taken, and sample mean monthly cost of electricity will be used to test the following null alternative hypothesis. So if the researcher believes and wants to test that is higher, he wants to prove, or she wants to prove that is higher, then this is the alternative hypothesis. Okay? Because the researcher wants to challenge what Duke is reporting, what is the status quo. Okay? So I hope it makes sense to understand that the null hypothesis, that the mean is smaller or equal to 104, and the alternatives mean that the mean is higher than 104. So assume that the sample data lead to the rejection of the null hypothesis. So I reject this hypothesis. What would be your conclusion about the cost of electricity in the Chicago neighborhood? So if I reject the null, after doing everything, I get evidence sample based on the sample that I rejected this hypothesis. What's your conclusion? The conclusion is that the cost of electricity is higher than 104. Okay, so that's what the answer is telling. Okay, so what's the type 1 error in this situation? And what's the consequence of making this error? So let's go back and read again. Type 1 error is rejecting the null when the null is true. In this case, we reject the null. We reject that the cost is smaller than 104. Okay, and we now believe that the cost is higher, but that's not true. The cost is really smaller than 104. So this is the type 1 error in this situation. We reject the 104, but the 104 is true. Okay, and why this happens? Well, this happens because we are using a sample and not the entire population to make the decision, and the sample may be biased. Maybe the researcher was not lucky and got a very biased sample, and then lead to rejection of this cost of electricity, and now everyone's going to believe that it's higher when it's not. And think about people maybe making decisions about moving to this neighborhood or not. They may be taking into account these results, and they may think that now it's very expensive, but when in fact it's not. Okay, so what is the type 2 error in this situation? What are the consequences of making this error? So the type 2 error is accepting the null when it's false. In this case, we are not accepting the null, so we don't have a type 2 error here. Because we rejected, we can only have a type 1 error. But if we, assuming we accepted the null, but the null is false, this means that we would accept that the mean cost is less than 104 when it's not. Okay, so let's take a look. Type 1 error is rejecting a null hypothesis when it is true. Okay, so you can read that later, but that's what it is saying. The type 2 error is accept when it's false, and blah blah blah. Okay, you can keep working on this, and I ask you to practice before you do the homework assignments. Okay, and now let's go back to our slides to finish with this chart. So this chart try to summarize this type 1 and type 2 error. Let's say our conclusion is accept the null hypothesis. And then the population, what is happening is that the null hypothesis is true. And if you accept the null hypothesis according to our sampling and hypothesis testing procedure, then we made the correct decision. However, if we accept the null, but in the population the null is false, then we have a type 2 error. Now, if our conclusion is to reject the null hypothesis, and the population condition says that the population the null hypothesis is true, then we are committing a type 1 error. And if we reject and the population condition is that a null hypothesis is false, then we made the correct decision. The problem is we never know what the population condition is. Remember, we don't know what is the true about the population. We always have to make our decisions based on a sample, and we have a likelihood of committing type 1 and type 2 errors in our hypothesis testing procedure. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and continue with the next video.